The boardroom was all glass, and money 50 floors above Manhattan and Catherine Street, James, was bored. The multi-billion-dollar Aerodyne acquisition sat open on the table. The janitor, some temp who'd knocked over a coffee cart, was still crouching near the wall, cleaning up his own embarrassment. Catherine gestured at the empty chair at the far end of the table. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me one reason I should or shouldn't sign this deal." The executive smiled, phones already angled. But when the janitor looked up and opened the deal documents, something in his face made the room go quiet. Ryan Cole had learned early that invisibility was a skill. You moved quietly, you kept your cart close to the wall, and you never made eye contact with anyone who wore a watch that cost more than your monthly rent. He had been doing this for 8 months, subcontracted through a building services company, assigned to the 49th and 50th floors of the Callaway Tower. And in all that time, not one of the executives had looked at him directly. That was fine. That was the arrangement. He mopped, he emptied bins, he disappeared. It was an agreement he had made with himself the day he took the job, and he intended to keep it. The boardroom on the 50th floor was reserved for the kind of meetings that moved markets. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, a long mahogany table that seated 20, and a view of lower Manhattan that looked like a diagram of ambition. By 7:45 on a Tuesday morning, it was already full. Catherine St. James had her acquisition team assembled, her legal counsel seated to her right, and a stack of due diligence documents organized by tab color in front of her. The Aerodyne Systems deal, a defense technology conglomerate valued at just over $4.2 billion, was scheduled to close by end of week. Everyone in that room believed it was already done. Catherine ran St. James Capital the way a surgeon runs an operating room, with total authority, no tolerance for imprecision, and an absolute expectation that everything in her environment would behave exactly as intended. She was 34 years old, and she had built the fund from a single seed investment at 26 into one of the most aggressive acquisition vehicles on the East Coast. People in her industry respected her, the way they respected weather, not warmly, but with the clear understanding that she could ruin your day if you weren't paying attention. She did not ask for opinions she hadn't commissioned. She did not suffer interruption, and she did not, under any normal circumstance, acknowledge the cleaning staff. Ryan had been working quietly at the back of the room, near the credenza, collecting used coffee cups from the morning's earlier briefing. The cart had a left wheel that occasionally caught on uneven floor seams, and when it caught that morning sharply at the worst possible moment, the metal rack swayed, and 2 ceramic mugs rattled against each other with a sound like a small, inexcusable explosion. Coffee sloshed onto the floor. Ryan caught the cart before anything fell, but the noise was already in the room, and Catherine was already looking at him. The executives around the table looked up. A few reached for their phones with the quiet reflex of people who had learned to document whatever Catherine found amusing. She leaned back in her chair and studied Ryan for a moment, the way someone might study an insect that had wandered into the wrong room. Then the corner of her mouth pulled into something that was technically a smile. "Come here," she said. It was not a question, and it wasn't warm. Ryan left the cart where it was and walked to the table. Catherine gestured toward the empty chair at the far end, the chair opposite hers, the one nobody used. "Sit down," she said again. Ryan sat. He placed his hands flat on the table and kept his face neutral, because he had learned that neutrality was the only safe response to whatever was about to happen. Catherine reached across and slid the Aerodyne acquisition summary down the length of the table until it stopped in front of him. It was 40 pages tabbed and color-coded, and the number on the cover page had 9 digits. "We're about to close a very significant deal," Catherine said, her voice carrying easily to everyone in the room. "Before I sign, I'd like to hear from all perspectives. So, tell me one reason I should or shouldn't." She opened her hands in a gesture of mock generosity. Several of the executives were already smiling. One of the junior associates turned his phone face up on the table. The room expected Ryan to stammer. That was the point of the exercise, to watch someone completely out of his depth flounder in public, to give the team something to laugh about over lunch. It was the kind of cruelty that disguises itself as spontaneity, and Catherine had a talent for it. Ryan understood this. He understood it clearly, and for a moment he simply looked at the document in front of him and considered his options with the same detached efficiency he applied to everything else in his life. He could apologize and step away. He could say something vague and harmless and let her have her moment. Both paths led to the same place. He'd go back to his cart, finish the floor, and be back tomorrow morning. Safe, invisible, and exactly where he started. Ryan picked up the document. He didn't flip through it the way someone unfamiliar with financial documents would, scanning page numbers, looking lost, searching for something to say. He went directly to the operational appendix at the back, to a subsection labeled Component Supply and Fulfillment, and he read for approximately 40 seconds. Then he set the document down. "Don't buy it," he said. His voice was even not loud, not deferential. Just a statement of fact, delivered at the same register as everything else in the room. Catherine's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. She had expected theater. What she got instead was a man who looked like he'd already done the math. "Excuse me," she said. Ryan turned a page in the appendix and laid it flat on the table facing her, though she was too far away to read it from her chair. "Aerodyne's primary revenue base is its long-term fulfillment contract with the Department of Defense for avionics subcomponents," he said. "That contract has a performance compliance clause that triggers an automatic review if delivery timelines slip by more than 12% in any rolling 6-month window." He kept his eyes on the page as he spoke, not out of nervousness, but because he was pulling the numbers in real time. According to their own logistics data in this appendix, which I assume your team reviewed, their on-time delivery rate has been declining for 3 consecutive reporting periods. The most recent figure puts them at 9.4% below threshold. One more quarter at this rate, and they breach the compliance clause. The DoD initiates an automatic contract review. That review is non-public. It takes 4 to 7 months, and the historical resolution rate for reviews triggered by performance breach is about 30% favorable to the contractor. The room was very quiet now. Nobody was smiling. Catherine had not moved. Ryan looked up from the page and met her eyes for the first time. "If that contract goes into review before your acquisition closes, you'll own a $4 billion defense company whose primary revenue stream is frozen pending federal arbitration. The data to see this coming is already in your due diligence package. It's in this appendix, 3rd section, tables 14 through 17. Whoever reviewed it either didn't read this far or didn't know what they were looking at." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ventilation system. Catherine's lead analyst, a man named Derek, who had a master's degree from Wharton and had been with the fund for 6 years, had already pulled his laptop open and was scrolling through a digital copy of the same appendix. His face was doing something complicated. The junior associate with the phone had quietly turned it face down. Catherine kept her eyes on Ryan, and Ryan kept his on her, and neither of them looked away first. Catherine reached across the table and took the document back. She turned to table 14 without being told which page. Her eyes moved across the numbers, once then again slower. Derek looked up from his laptop and gave her a single nod that she didn't acknowledge. She had already seen what she needed to see. Ryan watched her process it, the slight tension in her jaw, the almost imperceptible way her shoulders recalibrated, and he knew she was doing exactly what he had done. Pulling the implications forward, running the resolution scenarios, calculating the exposure. She was fast. He would give her that. Catherine set the document down. She looked at Ryan with an expression that had shed all of its earlier amusement and replaced it with something harder and more difficult to name. She did not say anything immediately, and the silence carried the particular weight of a room full of people waiting for someone far more powerful than them to to decide what the silence meant. Ryan stood up from the chair, pushed it back neatly, and looked at her one more time. "That's all I've got," he said, and he walked back to his cart, straightened the rack, and rolled it quietly out of the room. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said anything. And Catherine Street, James, for perhaps the first time in a decade, sat at the head of her own table and said nothing at all. Catherine did not sign the Aerodyne deal that morning. She told her legal team to hold the closing documents and sent her analysts back into the data room with a single instruction: verify every line in the operational appendix, starting with tables 14 through 17. It took Derek and 2 junior associates 4 hours. When they came back, Derek set a printed summary on her desk and said, with the careful neutrality of a man acknowledging a mistake he did not make personally, that the numbers were exactly as the janitor had described. The compliance trajectory was clear. 1 more quarter and Aerodyne would be in federal review. The acquisition at that price would have been a catastrophic overpay for a frozen asset. Catherine pulled the deal. She did it quietly, through a single communication to Aerodyne's board, citing unresolved due diligence concerns. 3 weeks later, Aerodyne's DoD contract went into formal review exactly as Ryan had predicted. The financial press picked it up immediately, and because Catherine had walked away at the last possible moment before signing, the story that emerged was the one that always emerges. When powerful people get lucky at the right time, she was a genius. She had seen something nobody else had. The coverage used words like instinct and prescient and trademark precision. She read every article and said nothing to correct them. Ryan Cole, meanwhile, was terminated by his staffing agency the following Monday. The building services company received a complaint unspecified about an employee on the 50th floor engaging with clients outside the scope of his contracted duties. The complaint did not come from Catherine directly. It didn't need to. Ryan collected his last check, returned his building access card, and left Callaway Tower without telling anyone where he was going. He did not make a scene. He had long since stopped expecting the world to be fair, and he was not surprised. He was just once again gone. But Catherine could not stop thinking about it. She had built her career on reading people, on understanding who was performing competence and who actually had it. And what Ryan had done in that boardroom did not fit any category she knew how to file. Her entire due diligence team, collectively holding more advanced degrees than most university departments, had reviewed the same document and missed what a contract janitor had found in under a minute. That wasn't luck. That wasn't a guess. That was pattern recognition operating at a level that her team, for all their credentials, simply didn't have. She needed to know who he was. She put her head of security research on it, and within 72 hours she had a file. Ryan Cole had not always cleaned floors. 2 years earlier, he had been a quantitative analyst at Aldridge Meridian, one of the top systematic trading firms in the country, where he had built a volatility forecasting model that outperformed the firm's existing framework by a margin that at the time had seemed almost implausible. He had been 30 years old and considered by the people who tracked such things quietly to be one of the more original quantitative minds in a field full of original minds. Then something had happened. The file was thin on specifics, but the outline was legible. A dispute over model attribution, a senior partner who took credit for work that wasn't his, and Ryan, rather than fighting it through channels, had walked out. The firm had blacklisted him through back channels the way firms do when they feel embarrassed rather than guilty. And the industry, which is smaller than it looks from the outside, had closed around him like water over a stone. He had been unreachable ever since. Catherine found him through a contact at his former staffing agency and arranged a meeting at a coffee place in Midtown that was loud enough for a private conversation. Ryan showed up in the same kind of clothes he'd worn at Callaway. Nothing expensive, nothing trying to be. And he sat across from her without any visible surprise that she was there. She had expected him to be angry, or at least to perform being unimpressed. Instead, he just looked at her, with the same even measuring expression he'd had in the boardroom, as if he was still running calculations she couldn't see. Catherine put her offer on the table without preamble, head of quantitative strategy at St. James Capital, a compensation package she named in full, without softening at full authority over the quant team and a direct reporting line to her. No intermediaries. Ryan listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "You humiliated me in front of 15 people for your own entertainment." Catherine held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "I did." Ryan looked at the table for a moment. He knew what this world was. He had lived inside it long enough to know exactly how it operated, how it chewed through people, and then hired them back when it needed something from them, and how the powerful always found a way to frame their self-interest as opportunity. He also knew that he was 32 years old, that his savings were nearly gone, and that the particular mind he had was being wasted on tile grout and coffee stains. He had made his peace with invisibility, but he had never made peace with irrelevance. "I'll take the role," he said, "but I pick my own team criteria, and I document everything." Catherine agreed without negotiating. Ryan arrived at St. James Capital 12 days later in a dark suit that fit him well and cost what he could reasonably afford, which was not nothing, but wasn't the kind of suit that made a statement. It made a statement anyway. The trading floor took notice immediately, not because of the suit, but because word had moved through the office the way word always moves through financial firms, fast, distorted, and with editorial additions. By mid-morning, most of the floor knew that Catherine had hired the janitor from the Aerodyne meeting and given him a senior title, and the reaction split predictably. Some were curious, most were contemptuous, a few were both. Preston Blake was neither curious nor contemptuous. Preston was the COO of St. James Capital, and he had been at the firm for 11 years, long enough to understand that his position depended on controlling the information that reached Catherine. He was smooth, well-dressed, and politically fluent in the way that people become when their actual competence is slightly below what their title implies, and they've spent a decade compensating. He shook Ryan's hand on the first day with a wide smile and said all the right things. Then he went back to his office and began making calls. Within a week, Ryan's analyst access requests were being quietly deprioritized by IT. Internal data queries from Ryan's team took longer than they should to resolve. 2 meeting invitations from Ryan to senior portfolio managers were answered with scheduling conflicts that resolved themselves once Preston had been consulted. Ryan noticed. He didn't say anything. He worked around the friction, methodically documenting each delay, each rerouted email, each access gap, building a record with the same patient precision he'd once applied to volatility models. He had been in this situation before, not this specific situation, but the category of it. And he knew that the best response to institutional obstruction wasn't confrontation. It was output. If your work was good enough and visible enough, obstruction became a story about the person doing the obstructing. The opportunity came 6 weeks in. Ryan's team had been running a scenario analysis on a cluster of mid-cap industrials with heavy exposure to a single commodity input, a specific rare earth element used in high-precision manufacturing equipment. The supply chain data told a story that the public price data hadn't caught up to yet. A processing bottleneck in the primary supply corridor that within approximately 90 days would hit production capacity and force a repricing event across the whole sector. Ryan presented the position recommendation to Catherine in a meeting Preston had attempted to have rescheduled twice. The fund took the position. 93 days later, the repricing event occurred within the margin of error Ryan's model had projected, and the fund's return on that position was the best single trade outcome St. James Capital had posted in 3 years. The trading floor did not applaud. It went quiet in a different way than before. Not the silence of contempt, but the silence of people recalibrating. Catherine sent Ryan a single message that evening. 2 words. No punctuation. Well done. Ryan read it and put his phone face down and went back to the data he was already reviewing for the next week. Preston Blake read the same trade result from his office and felt the specific hollow dread of a man who realizes that someone he underestimated is now standing very close to things he cannot afford to have examined. Because Preston's problem wasn't Ryan's competence, Preston's problem was that Ryan's role gave him access to the operational infrastructure of the firm, and the operational infrastructure of the firm contained, if you knew where and how to look evidence of transactions, that Preston had been routing through a series of internal accounts over the past 4 years. Small amounts at first, then larger, always structured to fall below the reporting thresholds that would trigger automatic compliance flags. Ryan had not found this yet, but Preston could see the direction Ryan's access requests were trending, and he understood with the cold clarity of someone who has been waiting for a threat to materialize that it was only a matter of time. Preston moved first. He had a contact in the firm's IT security department, a man named Gary, who had been with the firm for 3 years, and who had made a mistake of his own 2 years ago that Preston had quietly covered, for which meant Gary owed him something he couldn't refuse. Over the course of 2 weeks, Preston and Gary constructed a trail, a series of algorithm transfers from Ryan's workstation credentials, moving quantitative trading code to an external server, followed by a set of outbound financial transactions to an offshore account established in Ryan's name through a shell structure that looked on paper unimpeachable. The documentation was thorough. It was also entirely fabricated. The morning Preston chose was a Thursday. Catherine had a senior leadership meeting scheduled at 9, and Ryan was presenting a risk summary to the full management team. The meeting was 14 minutes in when the door opened, and 2 men in suits entered who were not from the firm. Preston stood up from his chair with an expression of performed reluctance that he had clearly rehearsed. He said he had an obligation to inform the room that the firm's compliance division had identified potential unauthorized activity linked to Ryan's access credentials, that external investigators had been contacted, and that he was sorry to have to do this here. One of the men in suits asked Ryan to stand up. Catherine looked at the 2 men. Then she looked at Preston. Then she looked at Ryan, who was already standing, his face completely still, his hands at his sides. There was a folder on the table in front of Preston, physical, printed, deliberately visible, and Preston pushed it toward Catherine without opening it. "It's all in there," Preston said. His voice was steady, measured the voice of a man doing something regrettable but necessary. "The transfers, the account records. I wanted you to have the documentation before anything else happened." Catherine reached out and touched the folder, but did not open it. The room was completely still. Ryan looked at her, not pleading, not performing innocence, just looking, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would matter more than what she chose to do with the next 30 seconds. She looked at the folder. She looked at Ryan. The 2 men in suits were waiting. Preston was watching her with the expression of someone who had calculated the outcome and was simply waiting for the math to resolve. Catherine's hand stayed on the folder. She did not open it, and she did not say, "Wait." Ryan was walked out of the building with his hands cuffed in front of him, past the trading floor, past the desk, where he had built the model that had made the firm 3 years of gains in 93 days. The floor watched in silence. Nobody said anything. Catherine stood at the glass wall of the conference room and watched him go, and the only thing she felt beneath the performance of institutional duty that she had just allowed to play out was the specific weight of knowing that she had, for the second time, made the wrong choice about Ryan Cole. The first time had been a joke. This time, she wasn't sure what to call it. Catherine opened the folder that night, not in the conference room, not in front of Preston, but alone in her office at 11 o'clock, with the building mostly empty and the city arranged in its usual indifferent geometry below her. She read everything twice. The documentation was thorough, time-stamped access logs, algorithm transfer records an offshore account established under Ryan's name, with a registration trail that moved through 2 shell structures before landing in a jurisdiction that specialized in not asking questions. On paper, it was airtight. That was the first thing that bothered her. In her experience, real financial crimes looked like accidents. They had gaps, inconsistencies, the residue of improvisation. What Preston had given her looked like a proof of concept. Every piece aligned perfectly, every timestamp, clean, every document present and accounted for. It was the kind of evidence that exists when someone has spent time building it, rather than the kind that exists when someone has actually done something wrong. She closed the folder and sat with that for a long time. Then she called her head of security research at 11:47 and told him she needed an independent technical audit of the transaction logs by 8 the following morning. Not from the firm's IT department, from outside. The auditor came back to her at 7:53 with a finding that was small, specific, and definitive. The outbound algorithm transfers attributed to Ryan's credentials had been initiated from a workstation on the 38th floor, Preston's floor, Preston's section of the building routed through a VPN profile that had been created 11 days earlier and assigned to a generic service account that no active employee was supposed to be using. Ryan's apartment, where the transactions had supposedly originated outside business hours, had an IP address that appeared nowhere in the actual log data. Someone had generated the documentation to say one thing, while the underlying technical record said another. The auditor had found the discrepancy in the routing metadata, the kind of detail that only matters if you're looking for it, and that Preston had apparently assumed nobody would look for. Catherine read the audit summary, once set it face down on her desk, and made a call to her chief legal officer. Then she made a second call, this one, to a number she'd had to work to obtain, and waited while it rang 4 times before Ryan picked up. His voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone who had spent a night deciding how much to trust. "I know what you found," Catherine said. "The transfers came from inside the building. Preston's floor. I have the routing data." Ryan didn't say anything immediately. Catherine continued. "He's going to move. If he hasn't already started, he's going to liquidate whatever he's been holding inside the firm and clear the logs before any formal investigation can pull them. I need you to come in. Right now." Ryan said, "You let them walk me out in handcuffs." His voice wasn't angry. It was factual, the same register he used for everything, and somehow, that was worse than anger. Catherine did not offer an explanation because she didn't have one that was worth the time it would take to say it. "Yes," she said. "I did. And I'm asking you anyway." There was a long gap on the line. Then Ryan said, "I'll be there in 40 minutes. He arrived at the building through the parking structure which Catherine had cleared for him, and they went directly to her office without passing the trading floor. Catherine pulled up everything her legal officer had already secured from the night's preliminary review. Preston's internal account activity over the past 4 years, the pattern of small transfers that had been structured to stay beneath compliance thresholds, the cumulative total that now sat at just under $18 million routed out of the firm across 31 separate transactions. It was not subtle if you were looking for it. It was nearly invisible if you weren't. Ryan sat at her desk and looked at the data, the way he looked at everything quietly with the full weight of his attention. And within 10 minutes, he had mapped the structure well enough to know where Preston would have to go to complete his exit. "He hasn't triggered the final transfer yet," Ryan said. "The last offshore leg is still pending. If he executes it before the end of trading today, the funds clear overnight, and the jurisdictional recovery process takes 18 months minimum." He looked at Catherine. "You need to keep him in the building and keep him busy until I can lock the outbound pathway and restore the original log data from the server backup that IT hasn't wiped yet." Catherine said, "How long do you need?" Ryan said, 90 minutes, maybe less. Catherine said, "I'll give you 2 hours." She went down to Preston's floor at 9:15 and told him she wanted a full operational review before the investigators returned with their formal request, and that she needed him in the room to walk her through the firm's internal account structure personally. Preston's expression was carefully managed. Cooperative concerned the face of a loyal COO, helping his CEO navigate a difficult situation. He followed her into the main conference room on the 38th floor and spent the next hour and 40 minutes answering questions that Catherine had constructed specifically to require long, detailed answers. She asked him about account categories she already understood completely. She asked him to explain reconciliation processes she had reviewed personally 3 years ago. She kept her voice even and her attention apparently genuine, and she watched his eyes for the moment when he would calculate that something had changed. That moment came at 10:52. It was subtle, a slight shift in his posture, a fractional increase in the speed of his responses, and it told her that he had either received a notification he couldn't act on or had reached the limit of what he could delay. Catherine kept talking. She pulled another document from her folder and laid it on the table and asked him to explain a specific reconciliation entry from the previous fiscal year. And Preston looked at the document with the specific expression of a man buying himself 30 seconds to think. He didn't have 30 seconds. His phone buzzed on the table between them, a calendar alert routine looking, and when his eyes dropped to it, Catherine saw his jaw tighten. She knew before he said anything that Ryan had done what he came to do. Preston stood up and said he needed to step out briefly to handle something in the systems department. Catherine said, "Of course," and watched him walk to the door and open it. On the other side were 2 people from the SEC's enforcement division who had been in the building since 10 o'clock at the request of Catherine's legal officer, along with a federal agent who had coordinated overnight with the preliminary audit findings. Preston looked at the 3 of them, then back at Catherine, and the performance finally dropped, not dramatically, but completely. His face simply became what it actually was, the face of a man who had spent 11 years being very careful and had still miscalculated. The arrest happened in the conference room quietly, without the kind of theater Preston had arranged for Ryan the day before. Preston did not say anything as they walked him out. He looked straight ahead, and the trading floor watched him go with the same silence it had offered Ryan, but a different kind. Not the silence of shock, the silence of people recognizing the shape of something they had suspected and not examined. Ryan's name was cleared formally that afternoon. Catherine's legal officer issued a firm-wide communication detailing the findings of the independent technical audit, which established that the evidence presented against Ryan had been fabricated using internal credentials, and that the investigation had identified the actual source of the anomalous transactions as a long-running internal embezzlement scheme unrelated to Ryan Cole or his work. The communication did not use Preston's name in the first paragraph. Ryan's name appeared in the first sentence. He was in Catherine's office when the communication went out, reviewing the restored transaction logs with the auditor, and he read it on his phone without changing his expression. Catherine asked the auditor to give them the room. When they were alone, she stood by the window, not behind her desk, not at the head of a table, just standing in the afternoon light with the city behind her, and she said, "I want to address the board formally next week. I'd like you there." Ryan looked at her. "For what purpose?" he said. Catherine said, "To say what I should have said the first time, in front of the people who need to hear it." The board meeting was held the following Thursday. 14 people around the table plus Ryan in a chair along the wall, positioned where observers sat. Catherine stood at the head of the table without notes. She did not use qualifications or passive constructions. She said that she had, on the morning of the Aerodyne review, subjected an employee to a public humiliation that she had framed to herself as harmless entertainment, and that she had understood even in the moment was neither. She said that when evidence was placed in front of her that implicated that same employee, she had allowed the speed of institutional process to substitute for her own judgment, and that a man who had been right once in a way that protected the firm had been walked out in handcuffs because she had not been willing to spend 30 more seconds thinking. She did not editorialize. She did not explain the difficulty of the situation or contextualize her hesitation. She simply said what had happened and what she had done and what it had cost. Then she turned toward Ryan and made an offer that she had already put in writing through legal counsel, a partnership position at St. James Capital, with an equity stake reflecting both his existing contributions and the value the firm had preserved as a result of his work on the Aerodyne deal. She named the stake percentage without softening it. She said this was not offered as compensation for what had been done to him or as an attempt to resolve what could not be resolved. It was offered because he had earned it, and because the firm needed what he had, and because those two things were sufficient justification without any other consideration attached. Ryan was quiet for a moment. The board members were watching him with the carefully neutral expressions of people who have learned not to show what they're thinking until they know what the most powerful person in the room wants them to think. Ryan looked at Catherine steadily, then looked at the table briefly, then back at her. "I'll accept the role," he said, "under one condition." Catherine said, "Name it." Ryan said, "Evaluation criteria for every hire and every promotion at this firm gets rebuilt from scratch. Compensation decisions, performance reviews, team placements, all of it based on demonstrated output and character. Not pedigree, not network, not which schools are on the resume. If that's a structural change you're willing to formalize, I'm in." Catherine didn't look at the board members for their reaction. She said, "Done." It was not a dramatic moment. There was no applause, no visible shift in the atmosphere of the room. The board members made notes, or appeared to. The legal counsel wrote something on his pad. Ryan nodded once and looked at the table in front of him with the settled inward expression of a man who had arrived somewhere real after a very long time of going nowhere. Catherine looked at him for a moment, not with warmth exactly, but with the kind of recognition that exists between people who have tested each other at close range and found out something true. And then she turned back to the board and moved on to the next item on the agenda. Outside the conference room, the trading floor continued its ordinary operations. Screens updated in real time. Positions moved. Numbers resolved themselves against other numbers in the endless arithmetic of people trying to be right about what would happen next. Ryan Cole had been right twice now, in ways that mattered, and the floor knew it, and the floor would adjust slowly, imperfectly, with the usual resistance of any institution that has spent years mistaking credentials for capability. But the adjustment had begun. Sometimes that was enough of a place to start. The only real measure of power, the kind that holds up under pressure, is not what you can make other people feel when you hold all the cards. It is what you choose to do when the person across the table has nothing and you do anyway. Catherine St. James had laughed at Ryan Cole because she could, and Ryan Cole had told her the truth because it was the right thing to do. One of those choices had almost destroyed him. The other had eventually changed everything.